In front of the Bennett estate, Susan counted the bills without looking up, but defolded exactly $100 into her palm and told Claire she now belonged with the man standing at the gate. Wesley Hart wore a worn jacket and shoes gray with dust. Brooke laughed as Claire carried a single small bag out of the house her own father had built, and Susan finally believed the burden was gone from her life. But the man they had just looked down on was hiding something that would reverse everything. Who was Wesley Hart really? The Bennett estate sat at the end of a long, private drive, white stone and tall windows, the kind of house that made delivery drivers slow down to look. Claire's father had built it over 9 years, and for most of Claire's life it had been the only place in the world that felt safe. He used to walk the halls at night checking that every light was off, and Claire would follow him barefoot, half asleep, listening to him name the rooms like they were people he was proud of. He died in the winter of her 23rd year, and by spring, the house had stopped belonging to her. Susan had married him 4 years before that. She had been careful while he was alive, warm in front of him, patient with Claire in the way a stranger is patient at a wedding. Her daughter Brooke moved in with a set of matching luggage and never once carried it herself. Claire remembered thinking back then that the house was big enough for all of them. She had been wrong about the size of the house and wrong about the size of Susan. The first thing to go was Claire's bedroom. Susan explained it as a renovation, said the east wing needed updating, and moved Claire's things into the small room, past the laundry where the previous housekeeper had once stayed. The renovation never happened. Brooke took the larger room and hung her own photographs in the hallway where Claire's used to be. Nobody announced anything. That was how it worked in that house. Claire simply woke up with less than she had gone to sleep with, and there was no one left to complain to. By the second year, Claire was up before 5 every morning. She started the coffee, pressed whatever Brooke intended to wear that day, ran the laundry, scrubbed the kitchen, and had breakfast on the table before Susan came downstairs at 8. Susan never said thank you and never said her name unless something had gone wrong. A water ring on the counter, a shirt with a crease across the sleeve, a delivery that arrived late because the driver got lost on the private road. Every one of those things became Claire's fault, delivered in the same flat voice as if she were an appliance that kept failing. Brooke made it worse in a different way. She never raised her voice. She would stand in the doorway while Claire mopped and described the dinner she had just come home from, the names of people Claire used to know, the restaurants Claire's father used to take the family to. Then she would walk across the wet floor in her heels and say nothing about the tracks she left. Claire learned not to react. Reacting cost more than it was worth. She had stopped asking herself why she stayed. There was no money in her name. Her father's estate had gone through Susan, and every question Claire asked about it was answered with paperwork she was never allowed to read. She had no savings, no lease, no family left on her father's side who had bothered to stay in touch after the funeral. Leaving required somewhere to go, and the only thing worse than being a servant in her own house was being nothing anywhere else. So she stayed. Claire would take it out and hold it under the lamp and remind herself that there had been a version of this house where she was loved and that she had not imagined it. And she got up before 5, and she counted the days without knowing what she was counting toward. There was one thing in that house that still belonged to Claire, and she kept it under the mattress in the housekeeper's room. It was a photograph curled at one corner of her father standing in front of the half-finished frame of the estate, sleeves rolled, squinting into the sun. He looked tired in it and completely happy. On the nights when Susan's voice was still ringing in her ears, it was in short sentences that closed the subject rather than opening it. She saw him again outside the market on the days Susan sent her for groceries. He sat on the low wall near the parking lot with a paper cup of coffee, and people stepped around him without seeing him. Once, when the bag split and oranges rolled across the pavement, he crouched and gathered 3 of them and handed them back, without a word about it. Claire thanked him. He nodded and went back to the wall. The town had decided what he was. The clerk at the market called him the guy who sleeps behind the hardware store, Someone else said he had come from out of state after losing his family. What people agreed on in the way people agree on things they have never verified was that Wesley Hart was a single father who had been through something that broke him, and that whatever he had once had, he did not have it anymore. He did not correct anyone. He said very little at all, and when he did speak, Claire thought about him more than she expected to. Not romantically, not even with much curiosity. It was simpler than that. He was the only person she had encountered in 2 years who had looked at her without measuring what she was worth. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in early October. Susan came into the kitchen at 7, which was an hour earlier than usual, and told Claire to come outside. Her tone was neither cold nor warm, which was itself unusual, and she did not explain. Claire dried her hands on a towel and followed her through the front hall, past the staircase out into the gray light of the drive. He was holding something in his right hand, and it took Claire a moment to see that it was money. He stepped forward and held it out to Susan, and Susan took it the way she took anything without hesitation and without acknowledgement. She counted it. Claire watched her thumb move through the bills unhurried and heard her say the number out loud when she reached the end of the stack. $100, Susan said, and folded it once and closed her hand around it. Then she looked up at Claire for the first time since they had come outside. "You've lived under my roof long enough. As of this morning, you go with him." Brooke was already there, standing on the top step, with her arms folded, smiling in a way that made Claire's stomach tighten before she understood anything. And at the bottom of the steps, standing on the gravel in that same worn jacket, was the man from the market. Claire heard the words and did not accept them. She looked at Susan's face, then at Wesley, then back at Susan, waiting for the part where this turned into something she could understand. It had to be a performance. It had to be a new kind of cruelty, a joke designed to humiliate her in front of a stranger, the way Brooke sometimes invited friends over specifically so they could watch Claire clear their plates. "You can't be serious," Claire said. Susan's expression did not change. There was no anger in it, no triumph she was straining to hide. There was only a mild, settled satisfaction, the look of a woman who has finally moved an obstacle she had been walking around for years. That was when Claire understood that Susan was not performing anything. She had made a decision, and she had already carried it out, and she was standing there waiting for Claire to catch up. The full shape of it arrived in Claire at once. Her stepmother had sold her, not sent her away, not disinherited her, not thrown her out in an argument that could be explained later as temper. She had accepted money from a homeless man in exchange for a person, and the amount she had accepted was $100. 2 years of 5 o'clock mornings of pressed shirts and scrubbed floors and swallowed answers, and that was the number Susan had put on the end of it. Claire's hands were shaking. She pushed them into the pockets of her apron so nobody would see. She heard herself say in a voice that did not sound like hers that this was her father's house. "Your father is dead," Susan said. "The house is mine. Everything in it is mine. And I've decided I don't want you in it anymore." Brooke laughed on the step above them, one short sound, and covered her mouth like she was embarrassed by it. She was not embarrassed. She said loud enough to Carrie that she had never seen anyone get such a fair price. Susan turned and went up 2 steps, and Claire thought for one absurd second that it was over, that Susan had made her point, and would now go back inside and let the morning continue. Then Susan reached behind Brooke's legs and picked up a bag that had been sitting there the whole time and threw it down the steps so that it landed at Claire's feet. Claire recognized it. It was her own bag, the canvas one from the closet in the housekeeper's room, and it was full. Someone had packed it. Someone had gone into her room while she was making coffee or the night before, and folded her clothes into it and zipped it shut and carried it down and set it behind the front door to wait. Wesley had not spoken since he arrived. He stood on the gravel with his hands loose at his sides and watched Claire, not Susan, and something in the steadiness of it made Claire more aware of herself than she wanted to be. He did not look like a man collecting a purchase. He looked like a man waiting for someone to be ready. That was the detail that finished it. Not the money, not Brooke's laugh, not even the sentence. The bag meant this had been planned. Susan had not lost her temper and improvised a cruelty. She had thought about it, prepared for it, chosen the hour. Claire had gotten up that morning and started the coffee for a woman who had already packed her out of the house. She crouched and picked up the bag. It was lighter than she expected. Everything she owned in the world, and she could carry it in one hand without her arm getting tired. "I want the photograph," Claire said. Susan looked at her without comprehension for a moment, then made a small gesture of dismissal, as if permitting something too trivial to argue about. Claire went back inside, walked past the staircase and the hall, with Brooke's photographs on it, into the small room past the laundry, and pulled the picture out from under the mattress. She held it for a second in the dim light, then slid it into the bag and walked out. And she did not look at any of the rooms on the way. Susan and Brooke were still on the steps when she came out. Nobody said goodbye. Claire walked down the drive with the bag in her hand, and Wesley Hart fell into step beside her, and behind them, the gate of her father's house closed with a sound she had heard 10,000 times, and never once from that side. They walked for a while before either of them spoke. The road ran downhill past the neighboring properties, then past the fence line where the private drives ended and the town began, and the whole time Claire was aware of the impossible thing she had just done, which was to leave with a man whose entire history she knew from gossip in a grocery store parking lot. "Why did you do it?" she said finally. It did not come out as a question. "Why would you pay money for a person?" Wesley kept walking. When he answered, he did not turn his head. "Because you needed somewhere to go." Claire waited for more. There was no more. He offered no story about pity, no speech about doing the right thing, no request for anything in return. He had said the only true sentence available and then let it stand. And something about the plainness of it made it harder to argue with than any explanation would have been. Wesley stopped at the gate, which was low enough to step over, and opened it. Then he stood back and looked at her directly for the first time since the drive. His house was on the far side of town at the end of a street, where the sidewalk gave up halfway down. It was small and low and unremarkable, one story, a porch with a single wooden chair on it, a patch of grass that had been cut recently, and not much else. It was not what she had pictured. It was not squalor, and it was not comfort. It was simply the smallest amount of house a person could live in without complaint. "And I won't ask you where. That door stays open in both directions. You should know something before you walk through this," he said. "I didn't buy you. Whatever your stepmother thinks she sold, she didn't own it, and I didn't take it. That money was the only way to make her let go of you without a fight, and it was worth every dollar to me to watch her take it. You don't owe me anything for it. Not work, not gratitude, not an explanation." He nodded down the street toward the way they had come. "You can turn around right now and go, and I won't follow you." Claire stood on the sidewalk with the bag against her leg and understood that he meant it, and that meant she had a decision to make, which was worse. Being trapped required nothing of her. Being free required her to choose, and she had not been allowed to choose anything in 2 years. Then she thought about the last 20 minutes. Susan had counted the money out loud. Brooke had laughed, and this man who had nothing had stood on the gravel and let them believe he was nothing, and had not once looked at Claire the way they looked at her. Claire lifted the bag and stepped through the gate. The house had 2 rooms that could be slept in, and Wesley gave her the better one on the first night without discussing it. It was the room at the back, with a window that actually closed a real bed and a lock on the door that he pointed out to her before he left her alone in it. He took the front room with the couch, and when Claire tried to argue, he said the couch suited him and went to make it up with a blanket from the closet, and that ended it. She did not sleep much. She lay on top of the covers in her clothes with the canvas bag on the floor beside her and listened for footsteps in the hall. None came. In the morning, she woke at 10 minutes to 5 out of pure habit, went out to the kitchen with her hands already reaching for a coffee pot, and found Wesley at the counter with 2 mugs poured and a plate of eggs on the table. He put one of the mugs in front of her and told her to sit down. Claire stood there holding the back of the chair, and it took her a moment to say what she was actually thinking, which was that she did not know what she was supposed to do to earn breakfast. "Nothing," Wesley said. "That's the whole answer. You eat it, and then the day starts, and that's it." The man appeared on the road in the middle of that same year. Claire noticed him first from the kitchen window, walking slowly past the gate. In a jacket that had been washed too many times, his shoes gray with dust all the way up the laces. He did not stop, and he did not look in. He simply walked the way a man walks when he has time and nowhere in particular to be, and then he was gone. It went on like that. He never raised the money. Not once. Not as a joke. Not as leverage in a disagreement. Not in the offhand way Susan used to remind Claire, whose roof she was standing under. The $100 simply ceased to exist between them the moment they walked through that gate. If Claire brought it up, and she did twice in the first week, he shut the subject with the same short sentence he had used on the road, and then he changed it entirely. Claire could not make it fit. She had lived for 2 years in a house with 14 rooms where nobody had ever once thanked her, and now she was in a house with 4 rooms, and a man who had nothing was treating her with a courtesy she had last received from her father. That was the thing that kept catching her off guard. Not the poverty, the respect. Within 3 weeks, she found work at a coffee shop on the main street, a narrow place with 8 tables, and a woman named Denise who owned it and ran the register herself. Claire took the morning shift because she was already awake for it. The pay was small and the hours were long, and the first time she was handed an envelope with her own name on it. She stood outside the shop and looked at it for a full minute before she put it in her pocket. She started buying her own groceries. She replaced her shoes. She opened an account at the credit union on the corner and put money into it every week, small amounts, and checked the balance more often than she needed to, just to see a number that belonged to her. None of it was wealth. All of it was hers, and after 2 years of owning nothing but a photograph, that distinction was worth more than the amount. The strangest part was how ordinary he made it. He cooked more often than she did. He washed his own dishes. When Claire cleaned the kitchen out of nerves one afternoon, scrubbing the counters until her hands hurt, he waited until she finished and then said the house had been clean before she got there and would be clean after, and that she should stop trying to pay rent with a sponge. Denise liked her, and the regulars learned her name. Nobody in the shop knew about the Bennett estate. Nobody knew what her stepmother had done on the front steps in October. For the first time since her father's funeral, Claire was simply a person other people were glad to see. She thought about the road behind her. There was no room waiting anywhere, no name she could call, no account with her name on it. If she walked away from this gate, she would be walking into nothing at all, and she knew exactly what nothing felt like, because she had been living in a house full of marble and sleeping in the housekeeper's room, who understood better than most what it was to be asked about a grave never asked again. Then there were the things that did not add up. He left before dawn at least twice a week, not with an explanation, not with a plan he mentioned the night before. Claire would wake at 5 and find the couch already folded up, and the coffee already made, and Wesley gone, and he would come back in the afternoon or the evening without saying where he had been. When she asked, he said he had things to take care of in a tone that was pleasant and completely closed, and there were the people. In November, a car slowed on the main street while they were walking, and the man behind the wheel looked at Wesley the way you look at someone whose name is on the tip of your tongue. Wesley turned his shoulder and kept walking. In December, a woman in a good coat stopped dead outside the pharmacy and said in the careful voice of someone who is almost certain that she knew him from somewhere. Wesley told her she had the wrong man, and he said it so easily, with such practiced calm, that Claire understood he had said it many times before. She did not confront him. She had spent 2 years in a house where asking questions cost her something, and the habit of not asking was still stronger than her curiosity. But she started keeping a private ledger of the things that made no sense, and the list grew longer than she was comfortable with. Somewhere around the 4th month, she stopped thinking of him as the man who had taken her out of that house and started thinking of him simply as Wesley. It happened quietly the way weather changes. She found herself watching the door near the time he usually came back. She noticed when he was tired. She began saving the strange things customers said at the shop specifically because she wanted to see him laugh at them later. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in February. The evenings belonged to the small house at the end of the street. She and Wesley ate at the same table most nights. He asked her about the shop and listened to the answers. She learned that he read a great deal, mostly nonfiction, and that he had lost his wife some years before, and that he had been a father, and that both of those facts lived behind a door he did not open. When she came close to it once, he told her plainly that he was not ready. And Claire, they were in the kitchen. His phone was face down on the table, and when it rang, he turned it over and looked at the screen. And Claire watched every trace of his usual steadiness leave his face at once. He stood up before he answered it. He said perhaps 6 words into the phone, none of which meant anything to her. And then he ended the call and told her that something had come up. And he had to go. He did not come home that night. Claire waited up until 2, then slept badly, then got up and went to the shop and made coffee for people whose faces she barely registered. He did not come home the next night either. By Friday morning there had been no call, no message, no note, and Claire had run out of reasonable explanations. The only thing she had was the phone. She had not touched it for 2 days, because touching it felt like the kind of thing Susan would do. On Friday, she picked it up anyway. There was one number in the recent calls with no name attached, and Claire wrote it on the back of a receipt and dialed it from the shop during her break. A woman answered on the second ring with a company greeting. Claire did not catch the whole of. Claire said she was trying to reach Wesley Hart. There was a short delay on the line, some sound of a hand over the receiver, and then the woman came back and said in the tone of a person reciting something she had said 1,000 times that Mr. Hart was in meetings all day, but that she could pass along a message if Claire wanted to come to the office. She came around the corner and stopped on the sidewalk. He was out the door in under 5 minutes. He took nothing with him, and he left the phone behind on the table. It was the one he used in town, the only number Claire had ever seen him give anyone. She stood at the window and watched him walk to the corner, and it was the first time since October that she had seen him move quickly. She went that afternoon straight from the end of her shift. She took the bus and then walked 11 blocks with the receipt folded in her hand. She had built a picture on the way of what she was going to find. A small office, a shipping company maybe. Some quiet job he was embarrassed by, some part of his life he had kept from her because it involved his wife, or a debt, or something he was ashamed of. Any of those she could have handled. Claire asked for the address. The woman gave it to her, and Claire wrote it under the phone number on the same receipt, and the address was downtown on a street she knew, and it did not sound like the sort of place where a man who slept behind a hardware store took meetings. The building went up 40 floors of glass and did not end. There was a name across the entrance in steel letters. There was a line of black cars along the curb, with drivers standing beside them, and men in overcoats moving through the revolving doors in 2s and 3s, and a security desk visible through the glass that was staffed by 4 people. Claire stood across the street next to a newspaper box and understood that she had made a mistake with the address, and then she looked at the receipt again and saw that she had not. She waited because she did not know what else to do. 20 minutes, then 40. The cold came up through her shoes, and then a black sedan pulled to the curb directly in front of the entrance, and a man in a dark suit came around and opened the rear door, and Wesley Hart stepped out onto the sidewalk, already inside the rhythm of it. Claire did not recognize the way he moved. The worn jacket was gone. The dust was gone. The suit fit him the way clothing only fits when it has been made for one body and no other, and his shoulders were back, and his face had none of the tiredness she had been looking at across a kitchen table for 4 months. 2 men were already coming down the steps to meet him, and a woman with a folder was speaking to him before he had finished standing up, and he was answering her while he walked. The glass doors opened. A row of people were waiting in the lobby, and Claire watched them come toward him the way people come toward weather. Someone took his coat. Someone else was talking about a floor number. And through the open door carried out onto the cold sidewalk with perfect clarity. Claire heard a man's voice say the words that ended her understanding of her own life. "Mr. Hart, welcome back, Chairman." Wesley came to the house that evening. He came alone, and he had changed back into ordinary clothes before he did it, which Claire found she could not forgive in that first moment. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her sitting at the table with the receipt in front of her, and he did not pretend not to know. "You went to the building," he said. "Why?" Claire said. "You have everything. Why would you live like a man who has nothing?" He sat down across from her and answered it properly, and afterward he found himself in a house too large to hear anything and surrounded by 100 people who would have said anything he wanted to hear. He said that when a man reaches a certain amount of money, people stop meeting him. They meet the number. Every conversation he had for a decade arrived pre-shaped by what he could do for the person having it. And after enough years of that, he could no longer tell the difference between someone who liked him and someone who liked their odds. He had lost his wife, and the grief of it had been managed for him by people whose job it was to manage things, as though it were simply a measurement he had taken. And then, he said he had met her. Claire sat with that. She thought about the market wall and the oranges on the pavement, and the man who had crouched and handed them back without a word about it. She thought about a woman who had counted $100 into her palm and never once looked at the man's face while she did it. "I loved you when I thought you had nothing," she said. "I know," Wesley said. "That's the entire point." The secret sat between them for weeks after that, and it did real damage before it healed. Claire had to accept that the man she had chosen had been running a test he had never told her she was taking, and she said so more than once, and he did not defend himself. What she could not honestly accuse him of was the thing that would have broken it completely. He had never wanted her poverty. He had wanted to be certain, before he let himself be loved, that he was being loved as a man, and not as an account. They married in the spring in a courthouse with Denise from the coffee shop as one of the witnesses. Claire kept working the morning shift for another 2 months because she wanted to, and Wesley never once suggested she stop. So he had stepped out of it. He had left the cars and the suits and the name behind, and he had gone and lived as a man with nothing in a town where nobody expected anything from him, and he had learned what he needed to know within a month. Some people looked straight through him. Some people were unkind. Some people crossed the street. It was the first honest treatment he had received in over a decade, and he said this without any bitterness at all. The annual foundation gala fell in October, almost exactly 1 year after the morning on the gravel drive. Wesley told her about it 2 weeks in advance and told her just as plainly that she did not have to attend. Claire thought about it for a night and said she would go, and the reason she gave him was that she had spent 2 years being hidden inside a house and did not intend to spend the rest of her life being hidden inside a better one, because she had learned a long time ago how to stand still while people looked at her and decided what she was worth. Across town, the Bennett estate was quiet. Susan had the television on in the front room out of habit more than interest, and Brooke was on the couch with her phone half watching. The broadcast moved to the gala arrivals, and the anchor said the name of the foundation, and then said that the chairman had come with his wife for the first time. Claire asked him how long. He told her the truth, which was that he had run the company for years, that his family name was on the entrance, and that he had never once lied to her about who he was, because she had never once asked, and that he was aware of exactly how thin a defense that was. She wanted to be angry, and she was. But underneath the anger, the question that kept surfacing was a different one. Not who are you? She had that answer now. The camera found them on the steps. It held on Wesley Hart in a dark suit, and it held on the woman beside him, and Brooke sat forward slowly and did not say anything at all. She did not move. Cars went past between her and the building. Somewhere behind her, a bus pulled away from a stop. The man they had bought her from the man Susan had handed a receipt of contempt to, on the gravel of the Bennett Drive, the man Brooke had laughed at from the top step, was the chairman of the company whose name was cut into steel above the door. Claire went home. She did not remember the bus. The event was covered live, because it always was. Cameras lined the entrance, and the coverage cut in as the cars arrived. Claire stepped out first, and Wesley came around beside her, and the noise on that stretch of carpet changed when the reporters registered who was on his arm. For years, he had come to this thing alone. The flashes arrived in a wall of white. The questions overlapped into a single sound, and Claire kept her chin level and did not hurry. Susan set down her glass. She looked at the screen for several seconds, without any expression on her face, and then she said Claire's name once, flatly, as though checking whether the word still worked. On the television, the anchor gave the chairman's full name again. Susan knew that face. She had stood 4 feet from it on her own front steps and counted $100 out of it into her hand, and she had not looked at it long enough to remember it, because there had been nothing there she considered worth remembering. Brooke said it out loud before her mother did. The homeless man, the one with the dusty shoes, the one she had laughed at from the top step while Claire picked up the bag. Neither of them moved for a long time. The broadcast went to a wide shot of the ballroom, and the two women sat in a house with 14 rooms and watched a girl they had thrown away walk into a room they would never be invited into. The worst of it did not arrive all at once. It arrived in layers over the following hour, and the first layer was simple loss, the arithmetic of what they had been standing next to and had failed to see. But underneath that, and this was the part that kept Susan awake, was something with a sharper edge. She had not sold Claire because Claire was worthless. She had sold Claire because she had been certain Claire would always be worthless, and she had been so certain that she had never bothered to check. By midnight, she had convinced herself there was still a way through. Claire was young. Claire had been raised in that house. Whatever had happened between them, there was a word that had always worked on her before, and Susan intended to use it. They came the next morning. That was the thing that could not be undone. A bad trade can be reversed. Susan had not made a trade. She had made a judgment about a person's entire future and had acted on it in front of witnesses. And now the person had a future, and Susan had put herself outside of it with her own hands for $100 on a Tuesday morning in October. Claire and Wesley had kept the small house at the end of the street. Neither of them had wanted to sell it. It was where Claire had learned what it felt like to be treated well, and Wesley had said once that it was the only building he owned that had never lied to him. They stayed there more nights than not. Claire was on the porch with a cup of coffee when the car pulled up. She recognized it before the doors opened, and she felt her body do the thing it had done for 2 years, the small tightening across the shoulders, the readiness to be blamed for something. She noticed it happening. She set the cup down on the rail and did not go inside. Brooke came behind her, and her smile was the same and worse, because Brooke had never even bothered to perform kindness before. She said the house had been empty without Claire in it. She said she had worried all this time about where Claire had ended up, and they were standing on her porch, calling it worry. Claire stood with her hand on the rail and listened to a year of silence being described as concern. Neither of them had called. Neither of them had come to the coffee shop on the main street, which was open 6 days a week and 11 minutes from the estate. Susan had never once set foot in that part of town, and nobody in the circle she kept would have considered the news worth carrying to her. They had watched a television broadcast and driven over the next morning. Susan came up the 2 steps and stopped just short of touching her. She said that whatever had happened between them, whatever mistakes had been made on both sides, none of it changed the one thing that mattered. "We're family," Susan said. Claire found that the word did not land the way it once would have. It sat there in the air between them, doing nothing. When part of the truth was that she had still been hoping someone in that house would eventually call her family and mean it. Now it had been said out loud in the right tone with the right expression, and Claire understood exactly what it was. It was not an apology. Nobody had said the words. Susan had not once in 10 minutes on that porch referred to what she had actually done. "Say what happened," Claire said. Susan's smile flickered. She said she did not know what Claire meant. "Last October, on the front steps. Say what you did." Susan came up the path first with her arms already open. She was smiling in a way Claire had never once seen on that face, warm all the way to the eyes, and she said Claire's name like it was the name of someone she had been looking for. "I have missed you," Susan said. "You have no idea how much." Susan looked at Brooke, and Brooke looked at the ground, and Susan recovered and said that things had been difficult after the funeral, that grief made people behave in ways they regretted, that the house had been under strain, and there were financial matters Claire had never understood. She talked for a while. She used the word misunderstanding twice. She did not use the word sold, and she did not use the number. Claire waited until she was finished. Brooke started to say something about how nobody could have known. Claire cut it off without raising her voice. "That's the part you still don't hear," she said. "You're telling me you couldn't have known who he was. I'm telling you it shouldn't have mattered who he was. You sold a person. If he had been exactly what you thought he was, you would still have done it, and you would be standing here today with no reason to apologize. And that is the whole problem." She thought about the version of herself who had gotten up at 10 minutes to 5 every morning to start coffee for this woman. That version of Claire would have folded at the sound of that word. She had wanted it so badly that she had scrubbed floors for it and been blamed for water rings and creased sleeves and late deliveries, and she had stayed, and she had told herself it was because there was nowhere else to go. Susan reached out then and took Claire's hand in both of hers. It was the first time in 3 years that the woman had touched her voluntarily, and Claire noticed that too. She let it happen for a moment. Susan said that they had lost too much already, that Claire's father would have wanted them to be together, that whatever Claire needed, she should just say it, that families forgive each other and start again. Claire drew her hand back calmly, without any force in it. "My home is here," she said. Susan asked for another chance. She said it twice, and the second time her voice cracked, and Claire believed that the emotion was real. That was what made it clearer instead of harder. Susan was genuinely grieving. She was simply grieving the wrong thing, because Susan had not driven across town to find the girl who had been humiliated on her front steps and left with everything she owned in one canvas bag. That girl had existed for a year, pouring coffee for strangers and putting small amounts of money into an account at the credit union, and Susan had never come looking. What had brought her here was a camera on a red carpet and a name in steel letters over a door. "You didn't come for me," Claire said. "You came for the life you found out I had. If I were still working the morning shift and living in this house exactly as it was a year ago, you would not be standing on this porch, and both of us know it." Susan's face did something complicated and did not produce an answer. Claire took a breath and said the last thing she had to say, and she said it without cruelty, because cruelty was theirs, and she had decided some time ago not to take it with her. "The day you sold me for $100 was the day you chose not to be my family anymore. You made that decision. I didn't. I lived with it for a year, and I built something on the other side of it, and it isn't yours, and there's no version of this where you get it back." She picked up her coffee cup from the rail, turned, and went inside. The screen door swung shut behind her. Susan and Brooke stood on the path in front of the small house, with the patch of grass and the one wooden chair on the porch. Nobody came back out. After a while, Brooke went to the car. Susan stayed a minute longer, looking at a door that was not going to open, and understood at last the thing she had spent the entire night refusing to understand. Wesley Hart had more money than she could hold in her mind. There was a version of the world where all of it could have flowed toward that estate. But the thing Susan wanted was not on the list of things his money could buy. She wanted the second chance, and she had thrown that away herself in daylight in front of her own daughter, and no amount of anyone's fortune was going to sell it back to her. The car pulled out and went down the street, and that was the last time either of them came. Inside, Claire stood at the window until the sound of the engine was gone. Her hands were steady. That was what she noticed most. A year earlier, standing on the gravel, she had pushed her hands into the pockets of her apron so that nobody could see them shaking. And today she had held a coffee cup through the entire conversation and not spilled a drop. Wesley came out of this kitchen. He had been there the whole time and had not once come to the door because Claire had told him a year ago that she had spent enough of her life being spoken about instead of spoken to, and he had understood without needing it. Explained twice. He asked her only whether she wanted him to do anything. Claire said no. It had already been done. Claire had been priced by her own family at $100, and in the end, she had found the thing that no fortune on any balance sheet could be exchanged for. She lived in a place where she was respected without having to earn it. Every morning, loved without having to be useful, and never once required to prove that she deserved the space she occupied. The photograph of her father hung in the front room, now in a plain frame, the curled corner flattened under glass. Claire looked at it most days. The house in that picture had never really been the point. He had built it because he wanted somewhere the people he loved could be safe, and Susan had kept the walls and lost the meaning entirely. Wesley had found the same thing coming from the opposite direction. Money and power had brought him everything except the one certainty he needed, and he had gotten it, standing in a worn jacket with dust on his shoes from a woman who had chosen him when she believed he had nothing to give her at all. The value of a person is not the money they hold, the position they occupy, or the advantage they can deliver to someone else. How we treat a person when we are certain they have nothing is the truest measure of who we are. And real love does not choose someone for what they carry. It chooses them, even when there is nothing to be gained in return. Susan and Brooke went back to a large, quiet house and lived with what they had done, which was the only sentence anyone ever handed them. Claire did not think about them often. She had decided on the porch that morning that the past had been allowed to run her life for long enough, and that she was not going to hand it the future as well. "You packed my bag the night before," Claire said. "You took money from a man you thought slept behind a hardware store. You counted it out loud on the steps of my father's house so that I would hear the number." Brooke laughed. "Nobody said goodbye to me." "That is not a misunderstanding. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it because you had decided I was worth $100.